Welcome back to my story. I wish you a good day. If you find it interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any interesting stories. Now, let's start the story. I never imagined I'd end up leading a neighborhood rebellion over something as simple as grass, but sometimes the smallest battles turn into the biggest victories. My name's Ethan Carter, and until last fall, I was just another resident of Maple Grove, a tidy suburban neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia, where the houses all looked like they'd been plucked from a postcard. I'm a graphic designer who works from home, which gave me a front row seat to the chaos unleashed by our HOA president, Marlene Hayes. I'd bought my house here 3 years ago, drawn by the quiet streets, the friendly vibe, and the promise of a peaceful life. For a while, it was exactly that. I kept my lawn trimmed, paid my HOA dues on time, and even helped organize the annual block party. Life was good, until Marlene swept into power. Marlene had moved into Maple Grove 2 years ago and wasted no time climbing the HOA ranks. Within months, she'd orchestrated a takeover, ousting the previous president, a laid-back retiree named Tom, who everyone loved for his common-sense approach. Marlene, on the other hand, treated the HOA bylaws like her personal rulebook for domination. She started small, issuing citations for things like mailboxes that weren't the approved shade of beige or holiday decorations left up a day too long. Most of us grumbled but complied, not wanting to stir the pot. I had my first run-in with her over my front yard flower bed. I'd planted a mix of wildflowers to attract pollinators, bees, butterflies, you name it. It was colorful, eco-friendly, and honestly, it looked great. But one crisp Saturday morning, Marlene showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, her fake smile tighter than a drum. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm doing my rounds and noticed your unapproved landscaping modification. Per HOA bylaw section 8.2, all exterior changes need board pre-approval." I leaned against my doorframe, sipping my coffee, trying not to roll my eyes. "Morning, Marlene. I actually submitted the paperwork for this last year. Tom signed off on it." Her smile didn't budge, but her eyes narrowed. "Well, that was the old board. I'm reviewing all past approvals to ensure they meet our standards. You'll need to resubmit." I knew right then that Marlene wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a control freak with a vendetta. Over the next few months, she ramped up her reign of terror, slapping fines on everything from kids' lemonade stands, unauthorized vending, to porch furniture that wasn't on the approved list. Most people paid up to avoid the hassle, but I started keeping a detailed record of every citation, every interaction. Something told me Marlene would eventually cross a line she couldn't uncross. That line came on a sunny Monday in September. I was working in my home office when I heard a commotion outside, neighbors shouting, doors slamming. I peeked out my window and saw something that made my jaw drop. Marlene, dressed in her unofficial uniform of a navy blazer and khakis, was walking down the street with a stack of neon orange citation notices, taping them to every single mailbox. I stepped outside to get a closer look. My neighbor, Mrs. Carter, a sweet 70-year-old widow, was holding one of the notices, her hands trembling. "Ethan, she's fining me $200 for my lawn," she said, her voice cracking. "She says it's not the approved grass type." "What does that even mean?" I took the notice and read it. "Violation, non-compliant lawn species. Per HOA bylaw 9.1, all lawns must be Kentucky bluegrass. Fine, $200. Payment due within 7 days." I looked around and saw Marlene moving from house to house, Her face set in a smug grin as she handed out fines like candy on Halloween. By the end of the day, nearly every house on the block had a citation. $200 fines for unapproved grass, uneven trimming, or excessive clover. My notice claimed my lawn had unauthorized dandelions. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just petty. It was extortion. I knew I had to do something, so I started digging into the HOA bylaws and local laws. What I found didn't surprise me, but it would definitely surprise Marlene. In Virginia, HOAs can set landscaping rules, but they can't issue fines for natural plant growth like clover or dandelions unless the bylaws explicitly list them as violations. Ours didn't. Plus, fining people for grass species without prior notice or a vote? That was a clear abuse of power. Marlene's lawn fining spree sent shockwaves through Maple Grove. The neighborhood chat group blew up with complaints, but most people were too scared to confront her directly. Marlene had a reputation for retaliation. If you questioned her, you'd suddenly get daily citations for the tiniest things. One family got fined for their kid's bike being parked improperly on their own driveway. Another got hit with a $50 penalty for excessive porch clutter because they left a pair of shoes outside. Marlene had created a culture of fear, and she loved every second of it. But her power trip didn't stop at fines. A week after the lawn citations, she upped the ante. I was sipping my morning coffee when I heard a loud argument outside. I stepped onto my porch and saw Marlene standing next to Mr. Larson's pickup truck, a triumphant smirk on her face. She'd attached a bright red boot lock to his wheel, the kind you see in parking lots, and was taping a notice to his windshield. Mr. Larson, a gruff mechanic in his 50s, was yelling, "What the hell is this, Marlene? You can't just lock up my truck." Marlene didn't flinch. "Your vehicle is in violation of bylaw 12.3. No parking on the street overnight," she said, patting the boot lock like it was a prized possession. "You'll need to pay a $100 removal fee to get this off, and fix your lawn while you're at it. You've got too much crabgrass." Mr. Larson's face turned red. "This is my driveway, not the street, and you can't charge me to unlock my own truck. That's insane." Marlene just handed him a bill and walked off to her next target. I grabbed my phone and started recording, knowing this was the kind of evidence I'd need. Over the next 2 days, Marlene booted 6 more vehicles for ridiculous reasons. A car parked too close to the curb, another for being an unapproved color. Apparently, bright yellow wasn't on her list. And even Carter's sedan for obstructing the sidewalk when it was clearly in her own driveway. Each time she demanded a $100 removal fee, threatening liens on people's homes if they didn't pay. The neighborhood was in chaos. People were furious, but Marlene's intimidation tactics kept most of them in line. She'd even started carrying around a megaphone, announcing violations over it like she was the queen of Maple Grove. I decided it was time to act. I invited a group of affected neighbors to my house for what I called a Maple Grove resistance meeting. 10 people showed up, including Mrs. Carter, Mr. Larson, and even Tom, the old HOA president. "What Marlene's doing isn't just annoying, it's against the law," I explained. "In Virginia, HOAs can't fine you for natural plants like clover or dandelions unless the bylaws specifically list them as violations. Ours don't. And booting cars on public streets, that requires a license she doesn't have." Mrs. Carter spoke up, her voice shaky. "But I paid her the $100 to get that boot off my car. She said she'd put a lien on my house if I didn't." Tom shook his head, disgusted. "That's extortion, plain and simple. The HOA has no authority to boot cars or charge fees like that." "Exactly," I said. And I've got enough evidence to prove she's been doing this to everyone. We just need to catch her in the act one more time." Mr. Larson grinned. "So, what's the plan? Call the cops?" "Not yet," I said, a smile spreading across my face. "First, we let Marlene dig her own grave. Here's what we're gonna do." The next Wednesday was a perfect setup. Maple Grove had a monthly yard inspection day where Marlene would patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. I knew she'd be on the hunt for more lawns to fine, and I was ready. I'd let my lawn grow a little wild over the past week, leaving a few patches of clover and dandelions on purpose. It wasn't a jungle, but it was enough to catch Marlene's eye. I also parked my car just an inch over the line into the street, technically a violation, but not enough to block traffic. Then I set up a discreet camera on my porch, angled to catch everything, and waited in my office watching the live feed on my laptop. Marlene didn't disappoint. At 9 a.m. sharp, her black SUV rolled up. She stepped out in her inspection uniform, khakis, a blazer with the HOA logo, and that megaphone slung over her shoulder. She circled my lawn, snapping photos with her phone, her lips pursed in disapproval. Then she moved to my car, taking more pictures before pulling a bright red boot lock from her trunk. As she knelt to attach it to my wheel, I dialed the non-emergency police line. "Hi, I'd like to report someone tampering with my vehicle," I said calmly. "They're trying to put a boot lock on it. I'm worried it might be vandalism or theft." The dispatcher promised to send an officer right away. I watched as Marlene taped a neon orange notice to my windshield, complete with the HOA logo and a demand for a $100 removal fee plus a $200 fine for my non-compliant lawn. About 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up. Officer Bennett, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Marlene, who was still scribbling citations. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "We got a call about someone tampering with a vehicle on this street." Marlene stood up, brushing off her hands with a confident smile. "Officer, I'm Marlene Hayes, president of the Maple Grove HOA. I'm enforcing our parking and landscaping regulations. This car and lawn are in violation of bylaws 12.3 and 9.1. That was my cue. I stepped outside, holding a coffee mug, acting like I'd just noticed the commotion. "Morning, officer," I called. "Is there an issue with my car?" Officer Bennett turned to me. "This your vehicle, sir?" "Yes, that's mine," I said, feigning surprise. "I was about to move it, but it looks like someone's put something on it." Marlene jumped in before I could say more. "This resident is in violation of HOA policy. Cars must be off the street during inspection hours, and his lawn is a mess. As president, I'm authorized to enforce compliance." Officer Bennett looked at the boot lock, then back at Marlene. "Ma'am, are you with a licensed enforcement agency?" Marlene's confidence didn't waver. "I represent the HOA, which has jurisdiction over neighborhood regulations." Officer Bennett's expression hardened. "Do you have a permit for vehicle immobilization?" "I don't need one," Marlene snapped. "This is private community enforcement." I stepped in, keeping my tone polite. "Actually, officer, Maple Grove streets are public roads maintained by the city, not HOA property." Marlene shot me a glare that could have shattered glass, but Officer Bennett nodded. "Ma'am, HOA bylaws don't override state law. In Virginia, only licensed agencies can immobilize vehicles and only in designated areas with proper signage." Marlene's smugness faltered, but she doubled down. "I've been doing this for weeks without any issues. If there was a problem, someone would have complained sooner." Big mistake. Officer Bennett raised an eyebrow. "So, you've done this to multiple vehicles? Do you have records of these actions?" Marlene, oblivious to the hole she was digging, pulled out her phone. Of course, I document everything: dates, violations, fees collected. She scrolled through her gallery, showing photos of cars with her red boot locks. Officer Bennett took notes, his expression growing grimmer by the second. "Ma'am, I need you to remove this boot lock immediately," Officer Bennett said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "What you're doing is unauthorized vehicle immobilization under state law. That's a misdemeanor, and charging fees without a license could be considered extortion." Marlene's face went pale as the reality hit her. I was just enforcing the rules," she stammered. "Rules you're not authorized to enforce this way," Officer Bennett replied. "Remove the device now, or I'll have to take further action." With shaking hands, Marlene knelt and removed the boot lock from my car. As she stood up, neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the sight of the police cruiser. Mrs. Carter approached, leaning on her cane. "Officer, that woman put one of those locks on my car last week and made me pay $100 to get it off," she said softly. "She threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't." Mr. Larson joined us, his voice gruff. "Same here. She locked my truck for no reason and charged me to unlock it. I had to cancel a job because of her." One by one, neighbors shared their stories, each one painting a clearer picture of Marlene's abuse of power. Officer Bennett listened, taking detailed notes, while Marlene's expression shifted from defiance to panic. "This is ridiculous," Marlene finally snapped. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to maintain community standards. These people all broke the rules." "Be that as it may," Officer Bennett said, "your methods are illegal. I'll need to confiscate these boot devices as evidence, and I'll need to see the others you mentioned purchasing." Marlene's face turned red. "They're at my house. This is absurd. I used HOA funds for those." Tom, the former president, stepped forward. "As a board member, I can confirm no vote was taken to authorize that purchase. Major expenditures require full board approval per our bylaws." Marlene spun on him, her voice shrill. "You were removed from the executive committee." "From the executive committee, yes," Tom said calmly, "but not the board." "You overstepped, Marlene." Officer Bennett called for a second officer to accompany Marlene to her house to retrieve the remaining boot locks. The rest of us stayed on the street giving our statements. By late afternoon, the situation had escalated. Marlene received multiple citations for illegal vehicle immobilization, and the police confiscated all 12 of her boot locks as evidence. Officer Bennett also informed those who'd paid her fees that they could file for restitution. That evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting at the community center. Word had spread, and the room was packed with residents eager to see justice served. Marlene showed up in a stiff gray suit, trying to look professional, but the air of authority she'd once carried was gone. Tom, reinstated as acting chair, opened the meeting. "Due to recent unauthorized actions and misuse of funds, we're here to address the conduct of our president, Marlene Hayes." Marlene tried to take control. "As president, I should be running this meeting. These accusations are nonsense." But Rebecca, the board secretary and a local lawyer, cut her off. Per our bylaws, an officer under review cannot preside over the proceedings. For the next 2 hours, residents shared their experiences with Marlene's tyranny. It wasn't just the boot locks. People talked about excessive fines, retaliatory citations, and a pattern of harassment that had made life miserable. One family had been fined for their daughter's chalk drawings on their own driveway, labeled as graffiti. Another got a $75 penalty for unapproved mailbox decor because they'd hung a small wreath. Throughout it all, Marlene alternated between defiance and excuses. The community was falling apart. Property values were at risk, she insisted. Someone had to take action. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. Beyond the illegal enforcement, there's the issue of financial misconduct. $3,600 was spent on boot locks without board approval, and the fees Marlene collected never made it into the HOA accounts. Rebecca nodded. Our audit confirms the expenditure was unauthorized, and the fees were never recorded. The room buzzed with outrage. Marlene's unauthorized fee collection wasn't just overreach, it was potential embezzlement. The fees were going to be reconciled later, Marlene protested, but no one was buying it. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president and bar her from serving on the board for 5 years. They also approved pursuing restitution for the misappropriated funds and refunds for all affected residents. Marlene stormed out, pausing only to glare at me. You set this whole thing up, Ethan. This isn't over. I just smiled. Have a good evening, Marlene. Watch out for those lawn citations on your way out. I hear the enforcement around here can be pretty strict. The aftermath played out over the next few weeks like a satisfying season finale. The district attorney pursued charges against Marlene for illegal vehicle immobilization. Her meticulous records, photos, dates, fees collected, made the case a slam dunk. She took a plea deal, restitution to all residents, 80 hours of community service, and a year of probation. The judge also ordered her to take a course on HOA governance and property law. The HOA filed a civil suit to recover the $3,600 spent on the boot locks plus legal fees. Marlene's attempt to sell her house was stalled by the pending lien, a poetic twist no one missed. The story even made local news after someone, not me, I swear, leaked my footage to a reporter. The headline, HOA Tyrant Mows Down Her Own Power, ran alongside clips of Marlene arguing with Officer Bennett. She became a brief internet sensation, popping up in HOA Nightmares threads and even getting a shout-out on a late-night talk show. But the real change happened in Maple Grove. The incident sparked a total overhaul of our HOA. Tom was elected interim president and introduced new rules. Major decisions now required community input via town halls and online voting. 6 months after what we dubbed Lawngate, Maple Grove was a different place. Our HOA meetings, once ghost towns, were now packed with residents pitching ideas. Community gardens, updated bylaws, transparent fine reviews. Marlene finished her community service by organizing traffic for a local festival, and her house finally sold at a loss. Rumor had it she moved to an apartment complex with no HOA, done with community governance for good. On her last day in the neighborhood, I saw her directing movers with the same intensity she'd once used to fine our lawns. I walked over with a parting gift, a small packet of wildflower seeds. A housewarming gift, I said, handing it to her. Low maintenance, good for pollinators, thought it might be symbolic. Marlene took it with a tight-lipped smile. Very funny, Ethan. I suppose you think you've won. I shook my head. It was never about winning, Marlene. Communities thrive when rules bring people together, not tear them apart. I hope you find that in your new place. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. Then she handed the seeds back. My new complex has strict rules against unapproved plants, she said, and walked away. Mrs. Carter joined me on the sidewalk, watching Marlene's moving truck disappear. Think she learned anything? She asked. I glanced at the packet of seeds in my hand. Hard to say, but I know we did. Sometimes the best communities aren't built by enforcing rules. They're built by standing up to the ones who enforce them wrong. Mrs. Carter smiled. My lawn's been fine-free for 6 months now. I laughed. Let's hope it stays that way. The only fines around here from now on should be the ones we pay for overdue library books. As we walked back to our homes, I looked around at Maple Grove, neighbors chatting, kids playing, a real sense of community taking root. Marlene's overreach had brought us together in a way she never intended, turning a quiet suburb into a place where we actually looked out for each other. Sometimes the most rigid forces in our lives are the most fragile, and sometimes standing your ground isn't just about winning. It's about planting the seeds for something better.